Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about the Las Vegas Summer League roster. A lot of familiar faces, of course, the rookies, guys on the Wolves roster, guys in the Iowa Wolves roster, but also a couple of other names that are new that we have to talk about today, what to watch for overall in Las Vegas Summer League kicking off this week. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sportsing like we want them to. And of course, all the playoffs are over now in the NBA and the NHL. We're looking to WNBA and baseball, and that's all we have going on right now. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hopefully you've had a fantastic start to your week. Las Vegas Summer League kicks off. Of course, Salt Lake Summer League, the kind of abbreviated Summer League, is happening right now. The Wolves are, of course, not part of that. Minnesota plays first on Friday. We'll talk a little bit about the Summer League schedule here upcoming. The Wolves did announce their Summer League roster on Sunday, and it was like basically at the same time I was recording Monday's podcast. So we didn't talk about it on Monday's show. Going to cover it today. Going to get in depth on, familiar faces, guys already on the Wolves standard roster. We're going to talk about guys who are familiar from previous Summer Leagues on the Wolves roster, as well as the Iowa Wolves roster in the G League. And then also some new names, some undrafted free agents, and one name in particular I'm a little bit excited about. So we'll get to all that here today on the show. As the week goes on, we'll dig in a bit more on especially the roster guys, the guys that are going to be on the Timberwolves standard roster come fall. What do we need to see out of those draft picks, out of guys that were in a Timberwolves jersey on the bench last year and didn't see rotation minutes? What do they need to do this week to show that they're ready to play come, training camp, preseason, and regular season in September, October this fall? All right, a big thank you here off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, let's go ahead and dig in on the roster. So the way that these work is there's always a couple of familiar faces, and usually there's a bunch more undrafted guys. Now, the Tim Conley regime, if you will, regime is an aggressive word, but we'll call it that, has more of a distinct Iowa Wolves flavor than what we saw under previous Timberwolves presidents of basketball operation, going back to the Tibbs years and the Rosas years. They liked to kind of dabble in all these undrafted guys. And this roster, the Summer League roster for Minnesota, by my count, unless I missed something, there's only 3 undrafted rookies on this roster, not including Jesse Edwards, who reportedly signed a 2-way. We'll talk a little bit about that. We talked about him, I think, late last week on the show. But there are 5 guys, actually 6 guys, if you include Dacian Nix, that were on the Timberwolves roster at some point last year or our first-round picks for Minnesota this year. And then you've got 4 guys who played for the Iowa Wolves last year, and at least in 2 of those cases were on the Summer League team previously as well. And then you've got your undrafted guys that we'll get into as well. So we'll kind of go through the roster, a quick overview first, then we'll dig in on a couple of these names. Guys that we're going to spend more time on later this week that are familiar names that everybody's looking forward to watching. Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr., of course, the 8th and 27th picks, respectively, in this year's first round. Wolves fans and basketball fans, period, I think are really excited to see what Dillingham looks like on an NBA floor. And Summer League, of course, is its own beast. I think Chris Finch referred to it last week in the rookie press conference. I think it was Thursday. He called, or no, it would have been Wednesday, I guess. He called Summer League some of the most competitive basketball you're going to find, which is funny because it's not, he didn't say it was the best or like the most fun to watch, but competitive because you've got a bunch of guys who are trying to prove what they can do. Maybe they're second round picks, that want to show like, hey, I could play a role in the team. or guys like, in the Wolves case, Josh Minott, guys who are trying to be rotation guys who've been in the league for a year or two. And then you've got players who have never played at the NBA level or undrafted guys, period, who haven't signed a real professional contract other than Summer League that are trying to make it in the NBA, the G League, overseas. They're literally playing for their basketball lives. So you're going to have guys that are playing really, really hard all the time, even if it's not aesthetically pleasing basketball and it's choppy at times. It's competitive basketball. So to see Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr. in this environment, it's going to be pretty interesting. We've seen the Wolves, going back a couple, 3 years, Jaden McDaniels, they asked him to be more aggressive with the ball in his hands. They asked both Josh Minott and Wendell Moore Jr., who, of course, was traded on draft night this year or just prior to draft night. Was it draft night? I think it was draft night. Anyway, he's with the Pistons now. We saw those guys be asked to do more with the ball in their hands in Summer League because, hey, let's see what you've been working on. Let's see what you can do. And there isn't an Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Mike Conley on the floor that are going to have the ball in their hands a lot. What can you do in this environment against, NBA caliber athletes in size for the most part in Summer League? So what can Dillingham do against superior athletes to what he faced night in and night out in the SEC last year? And SEC stands still have to admit, the quality of basketball you're going to see, you're going to have legit pros on the court. So what's that going to look like for Dillingham? Now, it's going to be different than playing alongside Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards, that's for sure. But it's still kind of that next step. And it's a legitimate step in the process to see what these guys look like in an NBA flow. And Terrence Shannon Jr. as well. To see it, and again, we'll get more in depth on this later in the week. I'll probably spend more time on Minott and Jalen Clark and Leonard Miller because they're real question marks. We haven't seen those guys in a professional environment consistently. Dillingham and Shannon, of course, haven't at all. But we're fresh off talking about them with the draft, and they saw a ton of time last year at the collegiate level, so we at least know what their games look like. And Miller, Minott, Jalen Clark, unless you watched a bunch of Iowa Wolves last year, you didn't see a lot of Leonard Miller or Josh Minott. And Minott didn't even play that much for Iowa. Jalen Clark hasn't played basketball in a year and 3 months or whatever, year and 4 months. So those guys have even more question marks. With Terrence Shannon Jr., I'll just say quickly, I'm excited to see him with the ball in his hands, to see him attack against NBA athletes and NBA size. Is he going to be more than a volume 3-point shooter? Now, with the Wolves, and this is probably his biggest challenge, with the Minnesota Timberwolves, not the Iowa Wolves, with the Timberwolves, Shannon's probably going to be a catch and shoot 3-point guy, transition threat more than a half court scorer, but he'll have the opportunity to half court score. And I actually think he's going to be really effective in Summer League because pace of play is going to be crazy. He's a volume 3-point shooter. He's going to have the ball in his hands. He's going to be one of 2-3 guys the Wolves are going to really feature offensively. He's going to have plenty of opportunity to put up numbers, to get dunks, to get steals, get out in transition. I think Terrence Shannon is going to have a really big Summer League. So Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr. are the two, of course, headliners for Minnesota. But a lot of Wolves fans are also going to be excited to watch Leonard Miller, Josh Minott, Jalen Clark. And I want to talk about the rest of the roster. So we'll set up the rest of the roster next. And then I'll spend just a couple minutes on some of these really 2 or 3 undrafted names, one in particular that I'm pretty excited about. So we'll get to all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at BetterHelp. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison is the thief of joy. It's easy to envy other people's lives, and social media only contributes to that. Social media can be good in a lot of ways, of course, but it can also be misleading and, again, really lead to comparison, which is, in fact, the thief of joy. It might look like people have it all together on Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. It can be pretty unhealthy to get bogged down in social media. I try to avoid it when I can. Obviously, I have to be on it to some extent, but I try to avoid it where I can. Therapy, however, can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life and not worry so much about other people. If you're thinking of starting therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so we talked already about a couple of the Timberwolves, the two Timberwolves rookies, drafted rookies, first-round picks that will be playing in Dillingham and Shannon Jr. Also, we'll see Leonard Miller, last year's top second-round pick for Minnesota. Remember, last year the Wolves had two second-round picks, Leonard Miller, who was the first few picks of the second round, and then Jalen Clark, who was a little bit later. We'll see Miller. We saw him at the NBA level last year. Again, we'll talk later this week about what I'm looking for out of Leonard Miller. I think he's got a shot at earning some rotation minutes for the Timberwolves this year, so I'm very curious to see him. He was fun last year in Summer League. He was fun in the G League as well. So Leonard Miller will play and play a lot. Jalen Clark, last year's second round pick, who is probably a borderline lottery talent before he tore his Achilles last March in UCLA and slid to the second round. Most people thought he was the best point of attack defender, one of the best perimeter defenders in the NCAA in the 22-23 season. So he fell all the way to Minnesota because everyone knew he wasn't going to play last year. So the Wolves signed him to a 2-year, two-way contract last summer. He sat all year, started practicing with the Iowa Wolves of the G League a little bit toward the end of the season, and was just cleared this past weekend to play in game full contact action. So the Timberwolves announced that over the last weekend. So we'll see Jalen Clark in Vegas. Very excited to see him play, see him lock some people down on the perimeter. The question for him, and again, we'll talk more about him and the other incumbents later in the week. What's the offensive game going to look like? Well, first and foremost, what's he look like athletically? How comfortable, sound does he look on the floor? It's fair to expect him to be a half step slow at the very least at this point after not having played in nearly a year and a half. But offensively, is he going to be able to develop into a player that can be a rotation player at the NBA level? I think the answer is yes, but there were a lot of challenges from offensively at UCLA. So what's it going to look like after this long layoff? Also, Josh Minott, who's got the most experience of anybody on this roster, at least in terms of longevity with the Timberwolves organization and professional experience. Again, we'll talk more about what to look for out of Josh Minott later this week. But those five guys are Timberwolves. I'm talking about the Iowa Wolves so much, I got to be specific. Timberwolves standard contract players, two rookies in Dillingham and TSJ, two second-year guys in Jalen Clark and Leonard Miller, and a third-year guy in Josh Minott. Those guys are all on the team. Iowa Wolves players, names that will look familiar. Of course, Daishen Nix, I'm putting him in that category instead of a roster guy because he's not currently under contract, and he was a two-way player for Minnesota last year. He'll be in Vegas with the Summer League team. Daishen Nix, still developing, of course, didn't play college basketball, has had a couple years at the pro level now. So still a little bit upside there. I think for the most part, we kind of know what he is, high volume scorer and, big bodied guard, not a great defender, not a super efficient scorer, but he's a talented scorer. If volume and inefficiency, yeah, sure. But he can score a little bit. So Daishen Nix on the team. Other familiar names. Javonte Cook has been with the Wolves in Summer League at least the past 2 seasons. Plays with the Iowa Wolves with frequency. He's just kind of a long wing. The book's kind of written on him so far. I think he might have actually been in training camp with the Wolves last year. And so he may get a chance again this year as a long kind of theoretically 3-and-D guy. The three-point shot has never been consistent enough, really, but good size, and he's a good defender. So good to see him on the team again. And then a couple of other names. Well, here's another one that's familiar that was also in the Iowa Wolves last year. Gabe Kalsher. Gophers fans remember Gabe Kalsher. He's a Minnesota native, and he played 3 seasons with the Golden Gophers before transferring to Iowa State, played 2 years at Iowa State. At this point, like when he came to the Gophers, everyone kind of thought like, hey, he could be a sharpshooter type. He shot 40% plus his first year with the Gophers. And then he ended up being more of a defensive kind of lockdown type guy than a consistent 3-point shooter. He still shot more than half his shot attempts from outside the arc, but he was only 35% his last season in college. He was in the 20s his middle couple of years there. So that the shooting never matched up with what he was supposed to be and what he was his freshman year with the Gophers. And he hasn't shot it all that well in the G League either. He played part of the regular season last year with the Iowa Wolves. He signed midseason, but he was with Capital City Go-Go in DC for a chunk of time as well. and overall was right around the 30% mark, actually a little below that, 27, 28% outside the arc. So he's really more of a defensive guy, a little small for a two guard. He's 6'4", decent wingspan. There just is, it's limited upside with Kalsher at this point. That's pretty clear. He's 20. He just turned 25 this summer. So not, just a familiar name, former Gopher, current Iowa Wolf, or I guess last year Iowa Wolf. So, and we'll get to some more Big Ten names here as well in a moment. So he'll be on the team. And then a couple other guys who saw time with the Iowa Wolves last year, Nigel Eastern and Coke Yacht, I think is how you say it. I lost my pronunciation. I promise I looked it up. Coke Yacht, I think is what it is. We saw him last year in Summer League. He played in parts of like 3 games in Vegas. Big, like 6'8", big wingspan, super, super athletic. Was on the roster of the Iowa Wolves last year. Has kind of bounced around. He's from Alaska originally, I believe. Really intriguing prospect. Very curious if he gets run at all. But just kind of a super athlete with great size, and I was very intrigued by him at this time last year, but he barely played in Summer League. Was kind of like out of the rotation for 2-3 of those games, and kind of an end of the bench type guys are often are in Summer League. So we'll see if he gets any time. Nigel Eastern was on the roster of Iowa last year, and just kind of a big power forward, big body, solid defender, solid rebounder, not a great offensive game. I don't know that there's a whole lot there to be super excited about. Not somebody that I'm going to focus on today, but he's on the roster as well. And again, was with the Iowa Wolves last year. A player we talked about the other day, Jesse Edwards, played at West Virginia, transferred to West Virginia after 4 years at Syracuse, and played his last year at West Virginia. Some similarities in terms of body type, albeit not quite as tall or long, but body type, the way he moves, some of the kind of spotty, but at times impressive touch around the rim. Some comparisons to Rudy Gobert for Jesse Edwards. And there was a report that he signed a 2-way deal. This was reported, I believe, by ESPN. He's got a Dutch background. And this was reported by ESPN in Europe, I believe, shortly after the draft, like in the hours after the draft, that he had signed a 2-way. The team has not confirmed it. I haven't seen it confirmed anywhere else. But if Jesse Edwards is on a 2-way, he is on the team either way. Jalen Clark is the only other player that's signed a 2-way contract at this point for Minnesota. So looking forward to seeing him. My guess is he gets a ton of playing time. And really, he's the only like legit center on this roster. Like there's a couple guys with some size like Eastern, and we're going to talk about a couple others here in a minute, but I think he's probably going to start at center and see a lot of run, obviously, besides Leonard Miller. We'll see a lot of Jesse Edwards. I'm very curious to see him play live and kind of come up with like what I said about him the other day, because I thought he was a solid fit as a 2-way backup big, a depth piece. Of course, Luka Garza's on a standard contract now, so the Wolves don't have a 5th big, so I get why he would be signed to a 2-way. There is some potential there as kind of the same type of player, rim runner, roll man, screen and roll big, who is effective as a rim protector, active defensively. I get it. I get the intrigue there with Jesse Edwards. 5 more names I'm going to get to. I'll name a couple here actually before I get to the final 3 that I'll spend a little bit more time on. Joe Wieskamp. Name should sound very familiar for Big Ten fans. Of course, the former Iowa Hawkeye. I hadn't realized he played as much in the NBA as he has. He played a couple dozen games with the Spurs 2 years ago. And then last year, Wieskamp played with who did he play with last year? I know he appeared in some games. 2 years ago with the Raptors. So 3 years ago with the Spurs, he was a 2nd-round pick, got into 29 games. 2 years ago with the Raptors, and then last year he played in the G League. And the idea is he's supposed to be a shooter, and that hasn't really panned out at the NBA level, or at the pro level, I should say. He's hovered around 33% in between the G League and the NBA in his limited action. He did in the regular season for the G League shoot 42% last year for Maine in 13 games. Overall, 37%. The year prior, 38%. So it's been kind of back and forth. But in order to stick at the NBA level, he's big. He's 6'6", but limited athleticism, not going to initiate offense, not a great defender, but can be decent on that end of the floor. He's going to have to shoot it north of 40% to stick. So he's on the roster in terms of familiar names. No doubt a lot of fans have heard of Joe Wieskamp. And then continue the Big Ten theme. Also, Tyler Wall, another Minnesota native, a 5-year player over at the University of Wisconsin, and was pretty good as a junior, and then played through injury his senior year, his actual senior year, struggled a little bit overall that year with some efficiency from the field, was just 42% from the field after being 52% in his junior year. And then he came back for a 5th year, took advantage of the extra year because of COVID, and was pretty good again last year. 11 points, 5 rebounds a game, almost 54% from the floor. And he is a 6'9" kind of power forward. I think he's good enough defensively. I think there's some rim protection there. The steal rate was solid for a big. He's got a shot at sticking as a Exhibit 10 G League type guy. So we'll probably see a fair amount of Tyler Wall, would be my guess. I don't think he's a true candidate for like a 2-way contract or an actual NBA deal at this point, but he's got a shot, I would say, more than Wieskamp, more than some of the other names like a Kalsher or some of the other guys I mentioned. I think he's got a shot at an Exhibit 10 type deal with the Wolves or somebody else, which means basically a preferred training camp player with a shot at sticking with the team's G League affiliate. So 3 more names to get to, one that we'll spend a little more time on, maybe even later this week, because we're running out of time a little bit here today, but 3 more names to get to. One you have to keep an eye on. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But the playoffs are over now for the NBA, for the NHL. It's really only regular season baseball. We're nearly to the Midsummer Classic, to the All-Star break, WNBA. Olympic trials, I guess, is all happening right now. The sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to in the months of, frankly, a lot of June, a lot of July, into August, until football kicks off again, and then we get to basketball again. But for right now, FanDuel keeps the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers, not just new ones, but all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone all day, all summer long. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, 3 more names to get to here on the show today. Let's start with Jaden Leday. Jaden Leday is a name to know, if only because he dominated in college. He is, however, about to turn 25 years old, I think later in July. And he's big. He's essentially a big forward. I'm trying to find, I lost his stats here. But they are impressive. I'm gonna pull them up. He played at San Diego State and was the best player on a really good San Diego State, what ended up being a good San Diego State team. He's 6'9" with a plus wingspan. He played 1 year at Ohio State as a freshman, a couple years at TCU in the Big 12, and then moved to the Mountain West in San Diego State, played 2 years there. Last year, he averaged, he didn't do anything. He didn't average anywhere near a double-double. It didn't average more than 8 points a game at any point until his senior year, his super senior year, if you will, his 5th year at San Diego State, or 5th year in college at San Diego State. He started all 36 games. He had never started more than 2 games in a season in his career. He averaged 21 and 8 last year. Shot 56% from the field, 57% on twos. He only averaged a little over 1 3 per game, but he shot 44% on threes, so there could be something to build out there. Free throw percentage has always been over 70%, so good touch as a scorer. A lot of what he did was he dominated in the post. He was very good in the post, which is obviously not a big part of what Minnesota does, or really any NBA team at this point. But he's solid defensively. Steal rate's good. Block number's fine. Block rate's good, I should say, for a 4. He's athletic, but he's also really good on the ball. He's built really well. He's strong. He's got a body for the NBA. The problem is he's not big enough or to be a 5, and he's not a good enough shooter to be a stretch, at least at this point, proven to be a good enough shooter to be a 4 or 5. He's exactly the type of player you want to see in Summer League, to see if he could run with some of the NBA athletes, play against some true size, and what could that turn into? So we may spend a little more time on him later this week. I think there's a shot he sees some decent run. I mean, there's a lot of kind of the 3-4 types on this roster, but I like potential. Now, again, there's limited upside because he's about to turn 25, But at the same time, he could be kind of plug and play for the Iowa Wolves and in an emergency for the Timberwolves. Like if he has that NBA body, the limited track record at college, though, does make you pause a little bit. So we'll see with him. James Bishop IV is another name, another guy who's an undrafted player, one of the other undrafted rookies. So I said there were only like 3 or 4 on the roster. Tyler Wall's one. We talked about him. Jaden Leday is another. James Bishop IV is another. He played 5 years of college as well. 1 year at LSU where he barely played, then 4 years at George Washington. And he's a scoring guard. In fact, there's a lot of similarities to him overall as a prospect to Rob Dillingham. He's just not the same shooter as Rob Dillingham is, and hardly anyone is. He's a very high volume scorer. He shot nearly 18 times a game a couple years ago, his second to last year at George Washington, averaged 22 points, but he shot 43% for the field and under 30% from three. Last year, though, he did manage to shoot 37% from three, but he shot so many twos per game at only 40% clip on 2-pointers that he shot only 39% from the field last year. He is a good passer, but he's small. So we're talking about a guy who's old. He played 5 years in college. He's only 6'2", and he's an inefficient scorer at times, but he obviously has a scoring touch. He's a really good free throw shooter, almost 80% for his career in college, and 3-point shooter for his career, only 33%, but again, 37% last year, by far his best year in college. So if the shot's for real and he can pass the ball and be physical enough at the pro level, there could be a future for him in the G League. I don't see him getting a spot on this Wolves team unless he gets the Dacian Nix kind of two-way point guard type role, although I don't see it. But I'm excited to watch him because I think there could be a lot of he had like a 44-point game this year for George Washington. Like there's a lot of scoring potential there. And Summer League, I should say, is a place where he may be able to shine because of the type of basketball that's being played in Summer League. All right. I'm not giving enough time to this, so I'm going to get back to him later, and I'm definitely burying the lead on this. But the guy I'm most excited to watch is Nadir Hiffi. Nadir Hiffi, that's what it is. He's French. He was actually just cut from the French team. And weirdly, because he was great last year in France, he's listed at 6'1", although I did see him listed as 6'3" somewhere else. There's a lot of highlights out there out of him, not very many reliable scouting reports. So if you just watch the highlights, you can see why he's got a shot at kind of sticking at the NBA level. Internationally last year in Euro Cup, he shot 39% from three. As a professional, he shot 37% from three, but he's still very young. I believe he's 20. And there's obviously a lot of mystery around him because I spent some time researching him and there's not a whole lot out there other than he's got good size, great scoring touch. And there's some excitement about like, what could he turn into as an NBA prospect? He's the name that's most exciting to me. Go watch his highlights. He's a lefty. He's crafty. He's not afraid of anything. He plays hard all the time. He's actually a pretty good on-ball defender. I think the athleticism will play at the NBA level. The size he's not quite as big as like a Dacian Nix, although his build is similar. He's maybe a little bit shorter. But he's definitely bigger than like Rob Dillingham. He's definitely thicker. He's got a bigger frame. He's stronger. He's not a shooter, a catch and shoot guy in the same realm as Dillingham, but again, not many guys are coming into the league. I think I'm just excited to see what he could be. And so I'm going to do a segment or two on him later in the week as we build up to Friday's Summer League kickoff, but he'd be a bit of an upset to get a two-way deal, but it's exciting that the Wolves will get a chance to see him up close because there's a lot of potential. Again, a late cut from the French national team, and wondering if the Rudy connection there has anything to do with the Wolves' interest, or if they got any insight at all into like what was happening there with his pending availability. So a lot to like with Nadir, and I'm excited to watch him at Summer League, hoping it's not like a Coquillette situation from last year where we get excited and then he doesn't see much run at all. But we'll keep an eye on that for sure. So more to come on Nadir Hiffi later in the week. We'll probably talk a little bit more about some of the other undrafted guys like Leday, and then certainly spend some time. Basically, I'll do a show on like, what do we need to see from the Timberwolves rookies at Summer League? Also, what do we need to see from the Timberwolves incumbents like Minot and Miller, and to a lesser extent, Jalen Clark, because we haven't seen him at all? What do they need to do at Summer League in order to cement a role, or I should say cement a roster spot, but potentially earn a role, even if it's on the fringes of the Wolves rotation next fall? So lots to get to later this week. The Wolves' first game of Summer League is this coming Friday night or really Friday afternoon. It's a 4 p.m. Central tip on ESPN2 on Friday. So that's upcoming here later in the week. We'll get you ready for that here as we get closer. That's all we have for today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also, of course, watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.